Welcome to Module 7, SPED 780. We're looking at written language in this module and how students are impacted by written language deficits in the secondary classroom. Now, over the course of Part 1 and Part 2 of the videos in this module, we're going to take a look at defining what a written language deficit is, what it looks like when you're dealing with that in the classroom. We're going to look at some accommodations that you can provide students and also how to provide direct instruction on written language. And then look closely at assessing written language, some of the tools that we have to do that in a formative and summative manner, and then developing IEP goals to address those written language deficits. So I think one of the things that's really important to always understand in these content areas is kind of where we sit on a national scale on proficiency. It really helps you understand where students with special needs are sitting compared to their peers and what that gap looks like. And I think that's really important for us because I don't know if you're like me, but as I work with students with special needs, and I'm in the classroom with them, especially if I'm doing a lot of pull-out resource time, sometimes I kind of lose my view or my scope of understanding on what their typical peers are able to do. And I start to get this really narrow focus based on their skill level of what they should be able to do. And so I think it's always important to really look at what are those expectations for all students, so we can really clearly understand that gap, and it also helps us clearly understand what is that end goal that we have for our students with disabilities. So if we look at the NAEP results from the latest written language assessment they gave, which is 2011, okay, this is a norm reference national assessment, so it gives us a real good idea just nationally how students with disabilities compare to those peers who are not identified as having a disability. So at or above basic, students without disabilities are at about 85%. You'll notice only 29% are at above proficiency. Okay, so that's still pretty low in terms of our general education students that are at or above proficiency, if you think about that. It's pretty low. And then 15% are below basic. Now, this is 8th grade that we're talking about. When we look at students with disabilities at 8th grade, 60% of those students are below basic. And then we've got 40% of our students with disabilities testing at that at or above the basic level. Now, you'll notice if you compare 8th grade to 12th grade, that ratio doesn't change much, which I think is a good thing for us to look at. So that what that means is that gap is not getting bigger. Okay, which is traditionally what we see as our students with disabilities get older. Their typical developing peers continue going up and they start to plateau, and that gap just continues to get larger. What we see here with the NAEP results is that that gap isn't necessarily getting bigger. So we have 38% of students with disabilities at or above the basic level at 12th grade compared to 40%. So not a very big change there. Okay. The same could be said really at those without disabilities. So you've got 82% at or above proficiency students not identified as having a disability in the 12th grade compared to 85%. Okay, if anything, that below basic kind of grows in 12th grade. So the percentage of students at below basic is growing. Okay, again, this is just really important for us to have a holistic understanding of what the expectations are for students, where their typical peers are. It helps us communicate that to parents. Sometimes it's hard for parents to understand, you know, my child's performing here, but what's a typical kid in the 8th grade? Where are they performing? You could do that really at any grade level, okay, when you're talking to parents. And honestly, it's hard for parents to have a good understanding of that, especially when they have a child with a disability. I can say, speaking as a parent myself, having a 2nd grader who has some pretty significant learning needs, frequently I can get tunnel vision on what Josie can do, and I think she's on track. You know, and then I go hang out in her classroom and I see what other students are doing. Other 2nd graders are doing this, and I know what 2nd graders should be able to do because I have the background, right? But it's still easy for me to lose sight of that and not realize the gap that she has. It's just important for me to understand that gap as a parent so I know things I can do at home to help her and have a good understanding of why those IEP goals are in place and why we need those goals. and really understand that well. So I think that's important for parents as well. We just have to be careful kind of how we lay that out there for them and be sensitive to their concerns on that. Since we are talking about secondary students in this class, I want us to also frequently be looking at what are employers looking for when we're talking about these skills, okay? This is a great report out of P21 talking about 21st century skills, where they really asked employers' perspectives on what skills they're seeing in new entrants, so new employees coming into the field, okay, and what skills they're seeing deficits in. So 72% of the employers in this report reported that students coming into the workforce with a high school diploma are deficient in writing. 72%. That's really high. Okay. 49% are reporting that entrants are deficient in the basics. So here we're talking about spelling, grammar. That's also really significant if you think about 50% pretty much of employers. Half of employers are saying, man, those new employees I'm hiring, they don't even have the basics. They're not spelling words correctly. They're not using correct punctuation. They have incorrect grammar in their sentences. The other thing that employers identified and reported is that writing is the second most important skill identified behind reading. Okay, so I think this is important for us to think about as we just finished looking at reading and the skills that are involved with reading. That it's very appropriate that the second one we're looking at is writing, because it's really critical, right, for students as they get into the workforce. And these are skills that even if you don't teach in high school, you're starting to build these skills up. So it's important for you to also be aware of these percentages, these expectations of employers. I want to just give you an example, because I've been doing some reading about texting and what is texting doing to students' writing ability, because I think that's interesting. That it's a technology that we haven't seen used as much in the past, but it's fostering students to write well, but is it fostering them to write well? What's that impact on written language? And there have actually been some studies done on evaluating students' text skills compared to their written language skills. And interestingly enough, I'm surprised. I thought it would be a detriment. So far, cities have not found that it's been a detriment. But it does lead us to some instruction we have to provide students on appropriateness, professionalism, that they may not use in texting, but they need to apply to the workforce. So this is, in an article I was reading, I pulled this out. This is a sample email message of a student that they were sending to the principal. And you'll notice there's a lot of texting lingo in here, shortening of words. And so, even as we're looking at preparing students for the workforce, how do we walk them through the two different kind of scenarios they live in? You text and you communicate in this way that's really relaxed. You're modifying the language a lot, right? But the workforce is not like that. Okay, so how do we help them balance those two things? And we can even focus on some of those things like grammar, spelling, even when they're texting. So this is a tool we can use for instruction, okay? And we can see improvement in students' written language away from the phone by using this tool. So it's just something that I want us to be aware of. I'm sure you've seen this, especially if you teach high school with some students. You've seen them maybe plugging in some things like this, but just a good thing for us to be aware of. Now, there's two ways that we can look at learning. Now, in your text, it talked about this a little bit. There's also an article that I really want you to take a look at because it lays this out really well, okay, for us to be thinking about. And we can think about written language instruction K to 12 in this manner. So are we learning to write or writing to learn, okay? So depending on which one we're doing, it changes our strategies, it changes our accommodations, changes our modifications for students. So let's look at what those are. So learning to write. Here we're learning two types of skills, composing skills and transcriptional skills. Okay, transcriptional skills, that word always gets me, are things like punctuation, capitalization, spelling, handwriting, or if you have a student that struggles with handwriting, typing. Okay, Composing skills are things like pre-writing, the whole writing process that we go through to compose written language. Pre-writing, planning, drafting, revising, really understanding those steps and being able to go through those steps effectively is teaching us how to write. Okay, so that's learning to write. Those are specific skills that we can teach. K to 12, target those skills. Now, writing to learn is something that we do in content areas. So we're learning about a particular subject and we're writing to improve our learning about that subject. Okay, so that is really promoting that content learning through writing. Helps us learn, it helps us clarify ideas that we're reading about, right? Or that we've heard the teacher talk about or we've watched on a video. It helps us organize our thoughts in our mind. And it also helps us really improve retention. When I was going through my doctoral program, I had some classes that were really lecture heavy on education philosophy. And I could space out so quick in those classes because it was just really hard for me to focus on things that were maybe a little bit more abstract when it came to learning. And so one of the things I often did to improve my retention was, really try to make detailed notes. And then after class, during that week, as I was preparing for the next class, I would rewrite my notes. So that really helped me organize my thoughts, but it really improved my retention of information that was kind of hard for me to have a firm grasp of and remember well. And so these are ways that we can write to learn. So we're going to take a look at some tools that we can use for learning to write and look at some tools for writing to learn. But before we do that, I want to take a look at some characteristics of a writing deficit. Now, students don't necessarily have all of these, okay? You're going to see a spattering of these. You're going to see some students that maybe have one or two of these. Sometimes you're going to see a student that just really struggles with writing and struggles with all of these. But I want to just take a look at some of these briefly. And you'll learn a little bit more about these in the article and in the text when you read it. But kind of some areas that students can really struggle with that we're going to see K to 12 and really in those early grades is unable to spell regularly or irregularly spelling words. Okay, spelling can really be a detriment to students' writing ability. So they're spending a lot of energy trying to spell words accurately, and it's taking energy away from that organization of their writing to making their sentences more complex, to really having some abstract language in their writing. Okay, so spelling can really limit that. Students can have difficulty planning how to write. So we're going to take a look at some tools in a little bit, and there are some resources in the module you can look at on how to help students really walk through that planning process. And I think the key here for students, until they're doing it well independently, is doing something consistently. So if you identify a tool that works for them, consistently using that every time as they're planning to write. And eventually that will become very natural for them to walk through those steps. But sometimes it's something that we really have to strategically teach them regularly with a lot of consistency on how to really get that skill of planning to write. The other thing that students can have trouble with is just not using abstract language or not using a lot of vocabulary in their writing. And there's some really simple things we can do here that are not complicated, that don't require any kind of technology tools. For example, my daughter Josie was working on a homework assignment. Josie really has trouble with abstract language. Okay, she has trouble adding details to her written work or adding detailed language, okay, to her work. So she had to write a paragraph about a person in her life that helps her a lot and provide a lot of detail and elaborate on how they help her. And so I just found a quick word list of adjectives to describe people. And I printed that out, and we talked through it, and we highlighted about 8 words that she felt like described to this person that she wanted to write about. And so we talked about, okay, how do we plug those words into what you're writing about? And so that just gave her a real simple list of words that she could pull and choose from that really increased the vocabulary in her writing and increased the language of it and the message that she was communicating. So even something as simple as providing students with some word choices, you know, those old word walls that have been around forever that elementary grades use, we can use those in middle school and high school. They can be very effective. So giving students some kind of content word lists are really helpful when we want them writing in those content areas. Writing convention errors, so punctuation, grammar, all of those things. We'll take a look at some tools we can use to help students evaluate their work better and be reflective on their work so they can identify some of those errors. But a lot of that also comes down to just writing more and more and more. It's going to help that. Let's see. Inability to link ideas and elaborate. So this again is going to go back to practice, but it's also going to go back to really scaffolding the writing process for students and really helping them connect those ideas. And a lot of times we can do this with graphic organizers that really allow students to connect those ideas visually, and then teaching them how to use that graphic organizer to then change it into written work, what that looks like, what that final product looks like. So these are just some characteristics of a writing deficit. You've probably seen most of these in one form or another working with students K to 12. So we're going to take a break here and we'll start part 2, strategies for addressing written deficits.